Well, I'm thrilled to be here. And I may say it's a rather special occasion because this is getting to be my 50th year of teaching at Berkeley. So there's a lot of history before that, and then part of it includes McGill. So I would like, first of all, to welcome our guest, Professor Heather Munro-Blum. She is Professor of Medicine at McGill University. Heather Munro-Blum served for more than 10 years as McGill's principal, the president, and vice chancellor, 2003 to 2013. A distinguished academic administrator and renowned scholar in the fields of psychiatric epidemiology and public policy, she served for 8 years as vice president of research and international relations at the University of Toronto, prior to appointment at McGill, overlapping with Robert Birgeneau. Did you know each other there?
Yeah. He was my boss.
Okay, all right. She is...
Anybody who knows Heather knows she has no bosses.
Okay. She has had many awards and honors, too many to read all of them here. Professor Munro-Blum is specially elected Fellow of the Royal Society of Canada, an officer of both the Order of Canada and l'Ordre National du Québec. She is a recipient of numerous honors and numerous national and international honors. I think everybody here is. It's wonderful. Professor Munro-Blum holds a Ph.D. with distinction in epidemiology from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, in addition to MSW, Wilfrid Laurier University, and BA and BSW degrees from McMaster University. And I must say that my engagement with McGill is remarkable. 56 years ago, I sailed in the ship, the Empress of Canada, across the Atlantic, and the sight of entering Canada for 1,000 miles up the St. Lawrence River is something that is welcome and amazing to all Europeans. It's a pity people miss it now by they land in the suburbs in some plane or another. Anyhow, it was incredible. And my call up for my military service in Yorkshire arrived while I was still on the ship, which is why I had gone to Canada. And I must admit, talking of McGill and everything, you're completely surrounded because you're boxed in with David Johnson, who was former principal of McGill, is the major speaker you just heard about. Turning to Professor Robert J. Birgeneau.
Everybody knows me. You can skip it.
Yeah, well, I'll say a little bit about it. Actually, I'm very lucky that I heard him and Professor Stephen Toop of UBC, the president of UBC at the time, 2012, talk on a similar subject, which of course was, shall I say, we were still in the valley of the shadow of death as far as higher education was concerned at that time. And so I was very lucky to have heard that talk and to be able to speak on behalf of Chancellor Birgeneau. A Toronto native, he received his BSc in mathematics from the University of Toronto in '63 and his PhD in physics from Yale University practically the next year. He served on the faculty of Yale for 1 year, spent 1 year at Oxford University, was a member of the staff of Bell Laboratories, as so many friends of mine of that era were. And they're now faculty members or Emerita at Berkeley. He joined the physics faculty at MIT in 1975 and was named chair of the physics department in 1988 and dean of science in 1991. He became the 14th president of the University of Toronto in the year 2000 until 2004, where he became chancellor, 9th chancellor of the University of California, Berkeley, serving till last year, May 2013. He holds faculty appointments of the Department of Physics, Materials, Science, and Engineering and Public Policy, and he and his wife, Mary Catherine, have 4 grown children, 9 grandchildren. I say this because I'm so glad they stayed. They didn't go off somewhere else. But I wanted to say on my own behalf that in my 50 years at Berkeley, I have never seen a chancellor or anyone else who has been so important to the survival of excellence at the university. This was a terrible time to be called into office here. He performed miracles on behalf of the students, on behalf of retaining faculty, on behalf of the excellence of many of the units. He was particularly strong in helping Canadian studies in times of need, a wonderful backer of Canadian studies. And as a curator of the Phoebe Hearst Museum of Anthropology, I'm thrilled to say that he's been a great backer of the anthropology and particularly the Hearst Museum. Thank you very much. I will now go on to the discussants. Excuse me. Well, Irene Bloemraad has already been introduced. And I want to say to you that she was recently in Ottawa. She was called to Ottawa to give a breakfast lecture on the subject of immigration to the Canadian Parliament. And this was just last month, so we are held in high honor in Canada, which is good. But that's because she has a distinguished career in this very subject. She has a Ph.D. from Harvard, an M.A. from McGill, is associate professor of sociology and the Barnes Chair of Canadian Studies. She's also a scholar of the Canadian Institute of Advanced Research and will serve in 2014-15 as a member of the U.S. National Academy of Sciences Committee reporting on the integration of immigrants in American society, which is one of her major topics. Her research areas are citizenship and multiculturalism, that is, how do immigrants gain formal membership, and she published a book, Becoming a Citizen, comparing immigrants' acquisition of citizenship in the United States and Canada, and you shall have to read it to find out which one is nicer. She's also worked with immigrant community organizations. What role do community organizations play in facilitating immigrants' political and civic visibility and influence? I'm an immigrant. I'm actually going to take my citizenship exam at the TSA next Tuesday, so wish me luck. I might become American after 50 years. As a result of this work, she developed the idea of civic stratification in the book, Civic Hopes and Political Realities. She's also studied political socialization in mixed status families. Results are published in the American Behavioral Scientist and in Studies in Law, Society, and Politics, and in Diversity and Democracy with works in the Canadian Journal of Political Science and in a new book, a previous book, Rallying for Immigrant Rights. So she is a person who is living out the problems that she actually has experienced herself. She was an immigrant from Europe to Canada, had to enter into a new school system, new society, new set of languages, and then later she mixed it up in her education at McGill and at Harvard. And we were very lucky in Canadian Studies when she was looking at Berkeley as a possible place against the other places where she were offered jobs, very, very good ones, I won't say which, but Canadian Studies really saw the chance that it would be incredible if she came here, and we did our best, and we are so happy that we managed in that. And as for the future, represented here by graduate student Brendan Shanahan, who just told me that the Canadian, but the Toronto hockey players are named after him, or the other way around. Like many Americans, he says he packed his bags and headed up north to gain an excellent and affordable education when he turned 18. Were you also called up for the Army?
No.
No, okay. You fled other things. There he developed a love of Canadian history, particularly subjects dealing with French Canada and immigration. His work on French-Canadian immigration to the United States and Quebecois interactions with immigrants in the late 19th and early 20th centuries became the subject of a museum exhibit at Woonsocket, Rhode Island. It was awarded the Gene Kistner Undergraduate Prize for the Association of Canadian Studies in the U.S. He's currently a doctoral student at Berkeley in history. He'll be taking his qualifying exams in the next few weeks. He studies the intersection of changing legal concepts of citizenship and rates of civic engagement amongst immigrants and their relatives in the late 19th and 20th century United States, for which Irene has agreed to serve on his dissertation committee. He also keeps his foot in very much in the door with Canadian studies and Canadian history, and he studies comparative conceptions of racial and national categories in the United States and Canada. Well, you are truly surrounded by McGill at every level. Okay, so I will ask you to give your initial talks, please.
Well, we're going to go in sequence here, and I'm going to start. Bob was extremely modest in saying that you'll have heard less about the Canadian perspective than the American. I don't know that that's true, but in any event, we'll put them into context together. But let me just say again what an enormous pleasure it is for me and my husband, Len Bloom, who, by the way, made his whole career here in California exporting Canadian values into the American system via the film industry, and to say how delighted I am that our Consul General, Cassie Doyle, is here, and so many distinguished McGill alumni, as well as the wonderful Berkeley community. We're going to talk about some of the tensions and challenges that we face, but I want to begin by just saying that it's my view that in both Canada and the United States, our citizens are blessed with extraordinary systems of post-secondary education. There is something for everybody, and there is, our institutions are broadly distributed. We have a diversified set of institutions that have different missions and mandates, and all of this serves us well. The public research-intensive universities, as we call them in Canada, share much in common with the public research-intensive universities in the United States. And both McGill and the University of Toronto are members of the Association of American Universities. So the 62, roughly, American universities, of which roughly half are private universities, and then 2 non-American universities, and we've both been in since the early 1900s. And you'll see some of the comparative funding situation that we face, that both Canadian institutions make their way repeatedly into the top tier of the AAU and of the international rankings on what is in Canada a fully public university system. We have no private research-intensive universities. There are some very particular differences that we face both from a public policy and regulatory point of view, and I think in some respects the way we express our missions, but overwhelmingly it's one family where we work in common cause, both within the public research-intensive university cluster and then with universities, both within state or province for us, nationally and internationally, that share our missions and some that don't. In some very creative collaboration. So that is a bit of backdrop, and I'm visually impaired right now because I'm working with the wrong visual aids right now, so I'm going to stand here if you don't mind. I didn't bring my reading glasses, so I can't see up close, and I have one contact lens in, so I'll just start giving a little bit of background here. So you know what the public research-intensive university is. I'm right in your sight line. Just a couple of distinguishing features. Much more research graduate education focused. Typically a broad array of professional programs at the graduate level, and a vast majority of the competitively awarded public research funding. We tend to be older and larger. But not necessarily, and we can talk about that, particularly the public universities. So that's just a little bit on the mission. What are some of the challenges? We're going to talk about that quite a bit, but writ large, from the Canadian perspective, it's over-regulation and underfunding. Notwithstanding attempts in a competitive federation for both our provinces and the federal government to invest, education is a state responsibility, and major research is traditionally a federal responsibility. And so the public research-intensive universities get a disproportionate amount of their resources on the research and graduate education side from the federal government. So that's just a bit of a, so what is, some people say, well, what would you do with more money? Let us count the ways. But dominantly, it means that we would provide better supports for life and learning for our students, particularly our undergraduate students. We would have the capacity to upgrade infrastructure to create more of the technology-assisted learning environments that we're both working hard to create. It would move at a faster rate. The lag time and ability to onboard technological and teaching aids would be faster. And then this whole issue of diversity, and we can talk about what diversity means, could be vastly accelerated, although both Berkeley and McGill are leaders in their systems in this regard. I've said this, I don't think the disconnect for the public universities, research-intensive universities, is that with post-secondary education dominantly a provincial concern, provinces fund headcount, they don't fund mission. They do it at the margins, not at the center. And so the more successful we are on the graduate student and research side, the more the average gets diluted on the basis of the provinces not coming in with their share of that. Equalization, a wonderful public policy principle that served Canadians well, is only good if not every public policy instrument is an equalization instrument. And so the need to really understand that in this era of globalization, of huge demographic mobility, all the things we know are happening, you cannot have local prosperity or social well-being unless you have preparation, education, services, and industry that rank with the best in the world. That becomes your local benefit, and that's part of the challenge that we face. And there are governance issues that we face as well. And I just have to point this in the right direction. Models of administration are in flux. Having lived in jurisdictions, and California has historically been the gold standard university system for the rest of the world, there is, and Canada invested very, very dramatically in education and research in the 60s, for example, through that period. I think there is some complacency about taking for granted these tremendous assets and really unique assets in this current context at a time when other nations are not being complacent. So the same esprit de corps that led to the creation of the Californian post-secondary education system is now being implemented in some 10 nations around the world in a very aggressive way, and they span the developing to developed spectrum of investment, of strategy, of saying we're going to have a very planned, differentiated university system. Just to give you a little, I don't know if you can see this, but just to put things in context, Canada has the second largest landmass of any nation in the world, and our population is smaller than the population of California, which is the most populated state in the United States. So we're at roughly 35 million, California is at roughly 38 million, and we are all along the border. The US is really important to Canada. Berkeley and McGill were both powerful and distinctive contributors to our respective home states. We drive reputation, and I hear this over and over again. I don't mean to put pressure on our consul general here, but that our diplomatic corps, as you know, McGill plays an enormously important role internationally. We are disproportionate contributors to economic productivity and growth locally, even in the spending that happens and the employment that happens around our institutions in attracting talent from around the world, service contributions to civil society, and as I said, with the public research-intensive universities, disproportionately contributing to research, to the making sure that the outcomes, output of our research goes to benefit society locally and beyond that in graduate and professional education. Here are just a few Berkeley-McGill comparisons. And this is where we'll get into some of the nuances of how we are similar and different. Berkeley has no faculty of medicine. Faculty and medicine, health sciences, and related are about half of the enterprise at McGill University, somewhat like the University of Toronto. So that's a fundamental difference. And in some ways, I think, explains some of the tenure track number differences. Research as a percentage of budget, 49% at Berkeley, 37% at McGill, roughly equivalent total student numbers, roughly equivalent proportionality of graduate students. Here's a big difference, but that's a difference for McGill within even the Canadian research-intensive universities, that we have always been deeply international. But I want to commend Bob Birgeneau for having put a real priority on this and having raised very dramatically the percentage of international students as a valuing of international students, not as a financial requirement. Just because we're here, I thought you might want to see the McGill downtown campus. We have two campuses. We have a very large West Island campus that started as the agricultural school and is now biosciences and environmental sciences. But we do have sun and we do have green grass in Montreal. This is going to be very different from the slide Bob will show you, that Provincial funding has stayed roughly proportionately the same, and if you went back further over a decade, it's been roughly the same. And one of the, I'm going to talk about some of the challenges in Quebec, but one of the great assets, aside from being in a really rich cultural milieu and a fantastic city, is that the province values fundamentally the diversity that comes from bringing in students from out of state and from around the world. So we have over 160 countries regularly represented in our international students. We have 225,000 alumni in over 180 countries around the world, and the Quebec government gives support to them. We'll get to the bad part in a minute, but that's a really important value. I'm going to talk for a moment about philanthropy, research relatively stable, and this is our real problematic area where tuition would normally run from 25 to 35%, and you'll talk more about that, Bob. We're at 17%. Domestic students pay $2,400 within Quebec, roughly $6,000 from the rest of Canada, and a Californian student would pay about $18,000 at the undergraduate level, depending on the program. I think I'm going to just go through this. I just want to say very quickly, this may be less pronounced here, although in your national media it doesn't seem to be. In Canada, there is a very big public speak about the uselessness of a university education, and it simply isn't true. If you look at the data, those with a high school education since 2008, 2009 have lost jobs dramatically. That's not below high school, that's with high school. Those with an undergraduate degree have, we're 10% of the American population, so I'll multiply up. But you think of it as roughly 6 million new jobs since then for those with a university degree, 3.5 million new jobs for those with a college degree, and minus 6.5 million jobs for those with a high school degree. And where people go with graduate degrees is increasingly aligned with their area of study, not disassociated from it. But of course, we know that people with masters and Ph.D s, roughly a third go into the academy, a third go into not-for-profit, and a third go into the private sector. Okay, I don't need to. I do want to also, in saying that Quebec has done some very creative things. The federal government, since the mid-1990s, has done remarkable creative investments that have allowed the research-intensive universities and others to really take their niche areas of world-class research, build them through infrastructure, through Canada Research Chairs, now Canada Excellence Research Chairs, which are used to recruit people from outside of the country. A real weakness, however, is that indirect cost recovery. What's yours, Bob? Your rate is? 56%. We get 17 cents on the dollar. At McGill, we would get 67 cents.
If you do it that way, it's 33 cents on the dollar.
Okay.
The total.
Okay, so 17 cents on the dollar, and our NIH rate would be, depending on the decade, but around 57 cents on the dollar for research that comes out of NIH, 17 cents on the dollar for research that comes out of our federal granting councils. But Quebec pioneered looking at the American system in bringing in indirect costs at a reasonable rate and built their provincial granting councils very early on and have stayed the course with that. The federal government has created very competitive graduate scholarships and fellowships, and just this last budget announced a Canada First Research Excellence Fund, which, if it's used as its mission was stated in the budget, will go disproportionately to support the institutions that are most productive in both quality of research and in the impact of the research coming out. What's our problem? Well, we've got a couple, but one is around 2000, Quebec move to a performance contract de performance. And that was an attempt in part to manage finances, but also to really begin to think about how do we as a province respect the missions of universities and the fact that if you're a regional university or a large, older research-intensive university or one of the new undergraduate-intensive universities, you could have a compact with the government that would allow you to be funded on the basis of what you thought you were there to do and the quality with which you did it. And over this, almost a decade and a half, if I showed it year in and year out, it was too complex to do as a graph, you would see overall the investments going up, but great vicissitudes in when money came in and a lot of unpredictability, but moving overall in the right direction. And some deregulation of international students, particularly around the STEM disciplines. 2012-13 came, budget cuts, 3 months to implement major base budget cuts, and massive layoff of admin and support staff, and some taking out of programs that were there, mostly undergraduate educational programs, courses in particular. And the biggest problem was not that, it was that we'd had in Canada 20 years at the provincial and federal levels, and that was true at our prior institution in Ontario, of base budget cuts in the middle of the prior decade, and some uncertainty with research funding, just got that all stabilized and then suddenly whipsawed again. So you try and do a 5-year plan, you build in your efficiencies while you're building quality and engaging the undergraduate student mission at the same time, and then suddenly you're off track, and unpredictability in your revenue capability is a very disruptive thing when you think about all we have on. I've told you about this deferred maintenance for a campus that started in 1821 is a constant challenge, but on regulatory it goes far beyond regulations on tuition to other forms of regulation that disproportionately treat the public research-intensive university in Quebec like it's any other university, when we know that graduate education, professional education, and so forth cost more. And that ends up feeling like you're going to either dilute the quality of your teaching or the quality of your research, or most important, the interaction of the two. And that all of the planning that's gone into moving very large traditional universities to keep the best of their mission and their activities, while at the same time opening up to new partnerships, new ways of teaching and learning, and bringing undergrads as well as graduates into the research enterprise, all of that gets quite disrupted. Just a moment about Canadian philanthropy. McGill is a medium-sized university in the Canadian context. Our annual gifts, annual giving, so independent of campaign, comes in at around $100 million a year. You'll see Bob's numbers, which I'm sure you'd still like to be higher than they are, and I'm sitting on the Stanford campus this semester, and that's a whole other world again. So annual giving at Stanford was our major campaign, biggest ever. For over 9 years, we brought in just over $1 billion in a campaign through extraordinary engagement of our alumni and friends. We've got the third largest endowment in the country, and the second per capita is by student in that context. I don't know if this is a trend here, and Bob can speak to that again, but philanthropy is coming in a very different way than it ever has, with our donors wanting to move out of giving money into endowment and wanting to give it for very, very specific kinds of things. And that means when we need a marge de maneuver, exactly when we need a marge de maneuver, we have less. On the other hand, the collaboration of really thinking about what priorities are with government, with donors, with alumni, and with our own active community is very, very strong. I've talked enough about that. So I'm going to just stop there. You know, the challenge is that at a time when what the public research-intensive universities do is at an all-time peak in terms of the scale of contribution, and there have been a number of American task forces that say it is the most powerful tool, if you will, from a public policy point of view in shaping the economic and social success of the nation. It's most at risk. The challenge constantly, how do we not only survive but thrive, be proactive, and what are the new models that we can bring into play? And with that, I've gone on too long, Bob, but I want to turn it over to you. Did I just turn something on?
No, you're good.
Good.
Give you a chance to get a glass of water.
Good. Okay, I'll also. So we had a wonderful talk in the School of Public Policy at lunchtime today by John Wilton, who sort of did what I'm about to do, but he took an hour and a half, and I'm going to try and do it in 10 minutes. But I think most of you are familiar with the challenges that we've encountered here in California for the last 6 or 7 years. Of course, I don't have to convince anybody here that universities are important, et cetera. And people also know that we've gone through an incredible period, not just to be too narrowly focused at Berkeley, but actually, first of all, the world itself has gone through a really incredible recession, huge federal deficit, significant structural deficit here in the state of California. And of course, all of these end up impacting any university, and in particular had really what turned out, fortunately, not to be catastrophic, but what could have been catastrophic effects on the wonderful California university system, not just the UCs, but the UCs, the Cal States, and the community colleges. And I must say, actually, in the UC system, we were privileged relative to the two other tiers because we had options that they didn't have. So we actually, in the end, have been better treated or have survived better than either the Cal States or especially community colleges. And that is a problem that remains to be solved. So in early 1980s, the state government provided 52% of UC's budget, and Berkeley, this is Berkeley in particular, and this is the absolute minimum, actually was 10.5% during the lowest, darkest days of my service as Chancellor. And this evolution actually happened quite rapidly. So when I started as Chancellor, so it was a very gradual decrease in percentage-wise state support, although that was in part because of percentages, as Heather was in our conversation was pointing out, in part because of the great success of our research mission. And so part of the decline in the percentage state support was because our research funding was going up very, very rapidly. So when I started as Chancellor, this number was actually 29%, which is not very long ago. So in 2004, the state provided 29% of our budget. And then we saw this very rapid evolution, devolution actually, down to 10.5% which at the absolute bottom. This led to an inversion of our financial model, which happened very quickly. Fortunately, we did a couple of things right. We didn't do everything right. I'm not that unsophisticated. I would say one of the most important things that we did, which Beata was part of and will remember, is in the 2007-2008 timeframe, when the recession was just starting, then our leadership team figured out what was going to happen and projected correctly. And so that turned out to be absolutely critical in terms of strategy. There was a lot of opposition to our strategy because people were in disbelief. But in fact, we got it right, which was, I think, in the end, really important for Berkeley, and it's why we get congratulated by people like Nelson, and because there were a remarkable large percentage of the academic administrators, deans, et cetera, right, who were convinced that the recession was just a temporary blip, and that it would last a couple of years, and that we should just borrow the money. This literally was policy being advocated by a number of people in the hierarchy, and that we could borrow the money, and then we'd pay it back in 2 years when the state budget came back completely. And we fortunately were a little bit more farsighted, realized that we were likely to see a fundamental change in the financial model for the university, and we had better adapt quickly to it. Among that, one of the things we realized is there was no silver bullet. So it wasn't that you could just say, well, let's do X and then everything will be okay. So we realized there was no silver bullet, that we were going to have to do a lot of things simultaneously, and we we're going to have to make progress and hope that enough of them worked that we could not just survive, but that we could maintain, obviously, our excellence as a university with an outstanding faculty, but also that we could maintain our public character, and in particular, serve the people of California, not just those from economically privileged backgrounds, but all the people of California. And the latter we did particularly successfully. So around the time, well, just before I started as Chancellor, at that time, state support was the largest component of our budget. Gifts and other, which is a lot of other stuff, including payout from the endowment, was next. Was comparable to student fees, which were modest. At that time, our tuition was a little under $5,000, and research was at about the level of $500 million. By 2011, we had an inversion where state support was now a minor component. The difference between 10% and 12%, it's actually 10.5 and 12, which is that 29 million, or about over 1% of that, actually goes to the office of the president. That was excluded in mine because I did not necessarily see that as well-spent money. Sorry, apologize to anybody from OP, but it's in this chart. And by the way, the salary gap between Berkeley's salaries and Harvard's salary is almost exactly the money that goes off the office of the president. See? Just as a factoid, which I think is sort of an interesting fact. Okay, and there were many profound changes. Fortunately, our researchers in a really difficult time just did astoundingly well, and the research volume just kept going up progressively every year. And I should say for people who are really technical experts on this, this doesn't include, for example, my own personal research money, which comes through Lawrence Berkeley Lab, or the support of my postdocs or graduate students. So this actually does not include a huge part of our research budget. And so there's, I don't know, 150 million more should actually be added on, which is on-campus research, which is supported through Lawrence Berkeley Lab. And so, in fact, and that just has grown progressively. In fact, in this most difficult time period also, Lawrence Berkeley Lab's budget, research budget, has almost doubled since I came here. And so that near doubling has been reflected in the supported research programs like my own personal physics research program and that of others. So if we really increase that to well over 800 million, then you see it's an even larger fraction. Okay. So this again just shows this inversion of the funding model. This is true for us, it's true for UCLA, it's true for UC San Francisco, it's somewhat true for UC San Diego, but not true at all, for example, for UC San Diego, or UC Santa Cruz, or UC Riverside. And so we've now had an extreme differentiation in the financial models for the different universities within UC, which is a really unfortunate part and which has raised issues for the stability of the master plan in California, which have not yet been solved at all, by the way. For example, just to give you an example, and I'll talk about it briefly, we've just successfully completed a fundraising campaign in which we raised $3.13 billion. Many of you know as a physicist, my goal was $3.14159 billion, and we almost got there, and actually I had a huge argument with Scott Biddy, because the head of fundraising, because he refused to count any of the BP money, the $500 million from BP, which we worked just as hard on as anything else. So I just said, just let me count 10 million of it. That's all we need. Anyway, there we are. But you see this dramatic increase in tuition. And so, you know, people who are either misinformed or malevolent or both, then said publicly, and there were so many newspaper articles and editorials saying that by increasing tuition so dramatically, tuition went from 5,000 to almost 13,000, that we had seriously damaged the public character of the university and made it less accessible. The reality is, not by accident, because we worked really hard on it, that over this time period, the cost in real dollars for low-income students who attend Berkeley went down, decreased, and student debt stayed constant. And actually this year, for the incoming class, the net cost of attending Berkeley for students from low-income backgrounds is the lowest it's been in modern history. And that's because we gave serious attention to financial aid. And a quirky thing that happened as part of resolving this. To show you how big the challenge was, when I was hired as Chancellor, and part of the recruiting package, it wasn't a package, but part of the arguments made to convince me to move from Toronto to California, was that Bob Dines had made a compact with the governor, Schwarzenegger. It's called the Compact. And without going into the details, if the compact had held, then in 2011, 2012, the funding we got from the government would have been $590 million. It was actually $240 million. So we were missing $350 million out of our total budget, which was close to $600 million. I mean, that's an astounding fraction of our total budget. That's the salaries of more than half of our staff. So literally, the state took away salaries for more than half of our staff in a very short length of time. And this is basically the challenge that we faced. So I actually have skipped all the slides that give the solution of how we manage this. We did a lot of things in parallel. Enough of them worked out that we were able to basically, in effect, replace the missing $350 million from a whole variety of sources. Some significantly improving our administrative operations in the university, making them much more efficient. When I arrived at Berkeley, and any long-timers will know this, there used to be an expression called the Berkeley way. When I first heard it, I said, what's the Berkeley way? And it in essence meant if you could figure out the most inefficient way to do something administratively, that's how you would do it. I'm very proud of the fact that the expression the Berkeley way has actually disappeared. You don't hear it anymore. I think that's actually probably my most important success, and et cetera. So where are we now? So we still are in a challenging situation. So first of all, for 3 years, we've had no tuition growth. And basically, the state funding does not quite cover faculty salaries. So it means staff salaries are paid entirely by student tuition, completely and entirely. There's no state support of any staff member. Staff may not like to feel like this, but that's the reality. So if tuition is frozen, then it means there's no funds for salary increases for the staff. But our staff work hard and they deserve salary increases. And so this fact that the Office of the President and the Regents have agreed to fix tuition is doing serious damage to our staff, especially the low-income staff. Okay. Second thing is, Governor Brown announced there's no longer going to ever, for campuses like Berkeley, be any more money for buildings. Even though we're a public university, that's something that has not been known by the public. So there's no money for capital projects. So all capital projects. So now we're indistinguishable from Stanford in terms of if you want a new building, no matter what the purpose is, education, research, the money has to come completely entirely from overhead and federal grants and from private philanthropy. And there were unrealistic savings mandates. So we've gotten some increased state support, but as we heard from John Wilton at lunch today, we have a continuing challenge. That's the negative side. On the other side, I have to say that we put a lot of energy into this, but one of the ways we had of addressing the issue was simply go to our alumni. It's a very rich area. The Bay Area continues to be very rich, and we basically explained to them that our financial model now is not fundamentally different from that of a private university. That whereas, in the past, someone might say, well, my daughter goes to Princeton, so I'm going to give my money to Princeton because Berkeley's supported by the state, and therefore they don't need my philanthropy. And so we, and I in particular, put a lot of personal energy, one by one, with people and with foundations, explaining to them that, no, we were in a different situation. And so this changed discontinuously, and I believe permanently. So we went from private philanthropy about $150 million a year to over $400 million. And so of universities without medical schools, Berkeley is now the largest, most effective fundraiser of any university in the United States, ahead of Princeton, ahead of MIT, et cetera, right? So This is a transformational change, and it's a permanent change. And in fact, poor Nick Dirks, as he said at this public event on Saturday night, his campaign's going to be $4 billion, right? So while we were raising money, I remember when we first launched the campaign, I went to Scott Biddy and I said, you realize that the goal we set means every single day you must raise $1 million. And if you miss this day, you got to raise $2 million tomorrow, right? And so he had a nervous breakdown. But in fact, we actually were successful, and we owe, there are some people like the Simons family or the Simpson family. They're both at the $100 million level. People may not appreciate that. The Hewlett, right, which is with the matched shares, is at the $220 million level, et cetera, right? So some number of people stepped up at a level that's just truly extraordinary, but there's also lots of $5,000 donors in there who are just as important. So I'm really proud of the people of California. That's our research, ramping up continuously. And note that this does not have the research funding that comes through Lawrence Berkeley Lab. So the research volume at the University of California, Berkeley is, for a university without a medical school, is simply astounding, okay? And it's a tribute to the quality of our faculty. Okay. So on January 20th, 2012, the Washington Post had an editorial which basically states this for the nation, not just for California, which is that we need a new model, right? And we have produced for the short term a model that's successful. It's not stable for the long term, I wish I could say, unless our philanthropy continues to grow. I spent last Monday, Mary Kath and I did, with actually Stanford's Board of Trustees, which was for a day a really interesting life experience about talking about challenges of higher education. So they're raising philanthropically, with half coming from the board, $800 million a year. So I asked their head of development, is it, sort of, boy, I'd feel pretty bad if I were you, sort of, right? Like, how are you ever going to keep raising $800 million a year? They're absolutely confident they can continue to raise $800 million a year at Stanford. So that sort of sets the standard for us. The difference is we don't have a board that gives $400 million. That's literally true, and it puts us at a huge competitive disadvantage, okay? Which is it was almost shocking, actually, anyway. So, and the board people are terrific, Stanford board. I mean, they're terrific. I mean, it was inspiring, actually, to be with them. So this is a national issue, not just a local issue. And so Mary Sue Coleman, who's our current president of the University of Michigan, and I are heading up a project for the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, which is called the Lincoln Project. And it's basically to address this issue nationally, that we need a new paradigm for the support of public higher education. Much of this would apply to Canada just as well as the United States. We have a very interesting committee. I think only 2 Canadians, me and Shirley Tillman, but we're disproportionately important. And you see we have a very quite varied committee of people, which includes business people, government people. We have both Gray Davis and Phil Bredesen, former governor of Tennessee. Let's see. Kay Bailey Hutchison, this great former senator of Texas, and Jim Leach, who was a congressman for 30 years from Iowa, representing Midwest. And so, and we're probably going to add to the political side. We have business people and university people, and we have data people. Henry Brady is heading up our data. So it's a very interesting, actually quite exciting group. The goal is not to write a scholarly paper. The goal is to figure out strategies that will work. Because we need creative ideas for the support of public higher education. Our financial model in the long run is not a stable financial model if we're going to continue to maintain the excellence of public institutions like Berkeley. I have a really crazy idea. So I actually have a solution. So I'll tell you my solution. And it's as follows. And I decided not to show it here. So turns out, it's California specific, but there must be a generalization. Phil Bredesen is going to help us for a state like Tennessee. So if you, and it came from one of our alumni who runs a large company. So I was in a conversation with him. I'll leave the company out. I asked this question having nothing to do with education. It has to do with the corporate board I serve on, where the same thing is an issue. So I said, how much money do you have sitting in bank accounts? Of course, they don't actually put them in bank accounts, but anyway. So it turns out this California corporation, which is a company that's where their heads are very supportive philanthropically of education, they have $6 billion onshore, which they're holding back, but they have $15 billion offshore. Okay. So I said, what are you doing with the $15 billion? Well, it turns out they have it in a hedge fund, and they're making 12% a year. So they're making $2 billion a year investing money that's sitting offshore. So I said, the California economy needs the $2 billion. You should bring it back. It needs the 15 billion. And they said, we just are not going to, as long as the federal government is going to subject it to taxes. We're just not going to do that. So my solution is a simple one, which is that and it turns out that 15 billion is a modest amount offshore for California high-tech corporations, that the amounts are astounding. The California high-tech corporations, if we could make a deal with the federal government, this is not actually as crazy as it sounds, where they would repatriate 1%. Remember, they're making 12%. So they repatriate 1% tax-free and donate it to higher education. And then the payoff is they get to repatriate another 1% tax-free. That solves our financial problem permanently. A permanent solution, right, to funding of higher education in California is repatriation of 1% annually of the money that our high-tech corporations have offshore. Crazy or not crazy? Right. So I tried this out on the president of MIT, and they already have their lobbyists. They do, working on it, right? So anyway, physicists are supposed to be creative. I thought it was a pretty creative idea. But it just shows you sort of, priorities of higher education. If 1% of money that's being held offshore solves our problem, right? I mean, that really shows you where we are in the hierarchy. But it also shows you if you're creative enough and you try new things, there are solutions out there. So I believe that, in the long run, we will continue to maintain Berkeley's greatness and its preeminence, but the current financial model is not indefinitely stable. Thank you.
Okay, we're going to do the following. First of all, Brendan and I both have questions that people from McGill sent in via email and other means. We're going to ask 10 minutes of questions from those questions that were sent in, and I think some of them will probably resonate with people who are here. And then we will open it to the floor so that all of you, or maybe not all of you, some of you will be able to ask your questions. And then after that, we will adjourn to a reception where we hope to continue these conversations over some drinks and food. So Brendan, start us off.
All right. Well, this comes from a current McGill undergrad, so I'd like to address this one first to Professor Munro-Blum, but also open up to Professor Birgeneau. University tuition in Quebec is the lowest in Canada, advancing the principle of equal access to education. However, as a result, institutions including McGill University are reimbursed less by the provincial government for enrolled students than other provinces or countries. McGill's deficit and current cutbacks, fewer courses being offered, larger classes, less funding for TAs, are arguably affecting its international prestige, standing and ability to attract and maintain the top professors and researchers in their fields. Here's the question. Is accessible tuition in Quebec to the detriment of the ability of schools like McGill to compete internationally? Are local access and global excellence mutually exclusive?
Well, it's a really interesting question. It had a big preamble, which one could...
Typical McGill smart undergraduate,
Well,
right?
yeah, the smartest. So let me say, first of all, that the quality of the undergraduate students, the students overall, and our programs is exceptional. And I talked about rankings, I talked about our role in the AAU and so forth, our support of that. I think disproportionately where we're hurt in not having flexibility with, and I would say flexibility with tuition fees, not more than that, is in all of the ancillary supports that would make the fullness of student life and learning optimal. That being said, there have been, because of the campaign, because of our success at the federal and international level in research, and some creative investments by the province and the federal government, some terrific programs. I'd say one of the most dramatic is in the area of actually graduate student support. So, you know, it's, I clearly argue for funding according to mission, and I think that would serve McGill best. I think it would also serve the small liberal arts universities in Canada best as well. I just want to say finally that, and this thought was really encouraged by what Bob said, that it is not good public policy to raise tuition and have government displace their investment. There have been studies, I conducted one actually, an international study back in 1999 that shows you just don't help the enterprise when you have philanthropy and tuition take up the slack that's coming from government pulling back. Good public policy has government stay the course, and then other players come in to augment it. So you get those ancillary investments that really allow you to optimize your ability to fulfill the mission. And that's what we're lacking currently.
So I agree completely with Heather said. Unfortunately, the reality in the United States is, and according to Phil Bredesen, governor of Tennessee, it's actually structural, unfortunately, that states they pay for higher education out of the discretionary part of their budget, and the flexibility in the discretionary part of the budget, partly because of federal imperatives, healthcare, et cetera, is decreasing progressively. So this is, most of us now believe in the United States that this is an irreversible trend. So we actually don't have a choice. Ultra low tuition, which we have at McGill, any economic analysis will show you, represents a transfer of income from the poor to the rich. So it's regressive, and so I don't believe in, and you know, people use the excuse of accessibility. Actually, it's a severe distortion of that concept. So
in fact, you should know Quebec, with the lowest tuition fees in Canada, has the lowest participation rate of university-aged citizens in university education.
So low tuition does serious damage to low-income people. And
if you're committed to growing student aid. So we take at McGill, for example, 30 cents of every net new dollar of tuition, put it into student aid. We have student support as a disproportionate beneficiary of all of our campaign philanthropic money, and our public policy work with government is disproportionately emphasizing supports the quality of student life and learning. That being said, if you have tuition rates at $2,400, as Bob said, it's a regressive tax.
So as tuition has gone up at Berkeley, we've dramatically increased the percentage of our students who come from low-income backgrounds, and we've lowered their costs. And it's frustrating that the media insist on distorting that, and to the damage of low-income people, because the media don't try to serve low-income people, they try to serve the privileged. Pardon me for the cynicism, but it's empirically true.
I have another question from an undergraduate at McGill speaking to the question of international students. So I'll first ask the question that was posed, and then I'm going to, as my role of moderator, add the sort of devil advocate's other side of it. The question was the following. Politicians view the ability to draw international students to domestic post-secondary institutions as part of a larger scheme in a globalizing economy. University students from abroad are an asset in terms of future foreign investment and transnational economic relations. How can universities take advantage of this in their relations with governments? Is it a potential bargaining chip? And the follow-up that I add, there has been public debate about bringing in international students at public universities. Are there problems associated with increasing the international student population? For example, are international students drawn particularly from more affluent backgrounds, and do they take the place of state or provincial students?
So I'll answer just very quickly there to say I do think this is a fundamental value difference between Canada and the United States, that we And McGill would lead in this with historically and currently in terms of the number of international students we bring in proportionally at the undergraduate as well as the graduate levels. We value that not as a source of revenues, but as a way of really enriching the learning environment and frankly the research environment, and creating very strong ties internationally to institutions and other entities for collaboration. So it's not a bargaining chip. It is, though, something that is valued. And I think I mentioned that Quebec uniquely, as a province in Canada, provides grant support for international as well as domestic students.
So we've always, at Berkeley and in all the major American research universities, had a significant number of international graduate students, and it's been really an incredibly important source of talent. It's more complicated at the undergraduate level, and because if you increase the number too high, then you end up displacing California students, for example, in the case of California. So there is a sort of an optimal number. On the one hand, there's no ambiguity that undergraduate education is enriched by having international perspectives in the classroom from fellow students, and so it's an important part of the educational environment to have international students. So here at Berkeley, as we ramped up the number of out-of-state and international students, we basically did that as an add-on. But of course, the faculty size didn't increase, so that was at the cost of the student-faculty ratio. So it's a somewhat complicated calculation. The Regents got very caught up with this, and one of the meetings, I looked down the table, and then I realized that of the 10 universities in the University of California system, 5 had chancellors who were immigrants who came here as graduate students. So answered at least part of the question.
Okay. Well, another question from a McGill undergraduate student, and I'll have a short follow-up, is there seems to be a trend among universities to be moving away from tenured positions, I might add, or at least decreasing, toward contract lecturers and adjunct professors. This shift makes economic sense in a labor market that is saturated with qualified instructors, but is there a risk that universities gradually lose the political, philosophical, and ideological traits that differentiate them? What does this mean for the homogeneity of the education students receive? And as a current grad student, I might add, what do you see that as a future for current junior faculty and aspiring grad students?
Well, that has not been the trend at McGill. In fact, we put a disproportionate emphasis on renewal of the tenure stream faculty, bringing in well over 1,000 new professors in under a decade, and 60% of them from outside of the country, from around the world, and moving even in our professional faculties to a stronger base of tenure stream professors rather than lecturers. Clearly there's a role that each of them plays. But I would say as well, if you look at the differentiated missions of universities, that issue may play out differently to benefit depending on the mission. But the tenure stream professoriate is the foundation of the public research university.
So I think this is it's really a very sophisticated question. I think it's a huge problem. When I was president of the University of Toronto, they were called sessionals, which was a euphemism for barely employed. And we had 1,000 of them. 1,000 people. Because we had nearly 70,000 students or 75,000 students with a faculty similar and not very different from that of Berkeley or McGill. So how you were going to teach 70,000 students? And so much of the teaching was indeed, undergraduate teaching was carried by so-called sessionals. And on average, it was a really unhappy group of people. So it was really, I think, a very unfortunate and unfair system. Fortunately, but that was partly driven by economics in the province of Ontario, and I very much hope that that's able to be addressed. Fortunately, here at Berkeley, we have a limited number of people, and the people who are in that role are really outstanding teachers. And so, for each of the 3 departments I'm connected with, there are a few people in that status, and they are people who are not interested in or maybe not talented in that way to pursue research careers, but do a really good job in classroom teaching. So I think as long as you have people who have very specified roles and that they have the respect of their colleagues, then it can work satisfactorily.
I would say the corollary is that if you don't grow, if the only way you can get more revenue or investment from your province in the Canadian model is by growing the headcount of students, and it is the dominant way. So all universities, U of T was 55,000 students in 98, 99, and it's 80,000 students today because that was driven by budgetary concerns. We were 22,000 students at McGill when I came in 2003. We're 35,000 plus to date. That's also driven by the need to bring in some financial support. The alternative, of course, to sessionals, and I want to say as well that we have gifted teachers across the different teaching categories. The alternative to bringing in more is that you grow class sizes. And that's not a good thing either. So, you're caught between a rock and a hard place on that.
All right, I think we should move to the floor. If you have a question, raise your hand high. And when you ask your question, please introduce yourself and keep it relatively short so we can get lots of questions.
Tony Kane. And you've both discussed funding changes in the aggregate. I'm wondering how things have changed differentially amongst departments in the school. One would think as you go towards private funding, it would be more towards practical sciences like engineering and computer science and whatever that would tend to be able to draw this private funding. So I'm wondering, is there an issue with certain departments suffering as a result of these changes, or have you managed to find a way to overcome these issues?
Mm-hmm. Well, one of the reasons that we fight as a priority to keep some autonomy as a public research-intensive university is especially because of that. That is, we value enormously the humanities and the social sciences. And it isn't the private sector alone where that happens that doesn't want to support. The negotiations with government about where investment is going to go are pretty intense as well. And as important as the STEM, science, technology, engineering, math fields are, I'm hearing in Silicon Valley we've got all the technology we need, and it's the human factors and social application of those and understanding really complex issues like intercultural fluency, psychology related to security, on and on. I mean, if you look at the issues that we face as a society, if we don't have the humanities and the social sciences, we're going to be in deep trouble. So our ability to actually say, if you out there, whether you're from the private sector or a friend, alumnus, or government, want to invest in specifically in math, sciences, engineering, we are going to take our grant and make sure we support the humanities and social sciences at a high level. And as we haven't touched on that theme, but it's an assumption under this that the interaction of the disciplines today is one of the most powerful sources of contribution to society. So keeping our autonomy to balance our investments is very important.
So the point you make is a good one. At Berkeley, because of shared governance and the role that the faculty play in determining where faculty positions go, even if the administration wanted to redistribute, they couldn't actually. So the only exception to that is that the business and law school have been able to have new faculty positions which are 100% privately funded, and I think each of them have but it's 10 positions out of 1,500 or something like that. But otherwise, within the rest of the university, the distribution has not changed in any significant way. And in fact, when we were able to start hiring again, the unit that got the largest number of slots and actually hired the most faculty was the humanities.
Because the attrition was...
No.
I'm surprised it hasn't been mentioned. I'm Nelson Grayman again. How about Proposition 13? Does this make California different from all the other states and provinces, or have all the other states and provinces caught up with this incredible limitation on rich people paying their taxes?
We have two horrendous propositions, 13 and 209. Maybe Prop 8 too, but that got overthrown. So you're right, it's a fundamental limitation to funding of education in California, Prop 13. But there are states that are worse off. So like among the 50 states, I think we're 11th from the bottom. So there are 10 that are actually worse off than we are. So it's not just Prop 13.
Such a distortion.
Yeah, it's huge. And then of course we also have Prop 8, or Prop 209, which has prevented us from taking into account the realities that we would like to believe we live in a society in which racism plays no role, but unfortunately that's not the reality, and we're not allowed to take that into account. And people say just use surrogates, and I can tell you we tried every surrogate we could think of, and surrogates are not successful. They don't work.
Hi, I was just...
Hey, Andrew, good to see you.
Good to see you. It's David Stewart.
David, sorry.
Formerly with the consulate. So
Hi, David.
I used to, for the past year and a half, I've been involved in a couple of projects in higher education policy that have focused on kind of reforming teaching or looking at teaching in new ways. And one of the trends that I've noticed at the highest policy levels, there seems to be a perception among policymakers of a certain kind of skills gap. And that people are graduating from universities, but they're not coming out with marketable skills. And one of the ways that policymakers are trying to solve this is by trying to tie funding to more kind of hands-on, what they call like 21st century skills. So one of the things that I've noticed is, for example, in Ontario, I recently had a meeting and they said that there were 38 entrepreneurship accelerators inside of higher education institutions. So I was just kind of curious to hear your comments, if this is just like a small trend. I mean, I've been quite close to it, so I'm not sure how it's impacting high-level research universities, and just interested in what you think about that.
Well, I'll speak maybe very quickly to the Canadian situation. The gaps are at two parts of this employment cycle, if you want to call it. One, Canada produces PhDs currently, controlling for population size. And if you look at where business startups happen, they are research PhD led rather, and that doesn't mean there aren't people who, you hear a lot of emphasis on the person who just kind of woke up in the morning and did something brilliant and made $1 billion, but disproportionately graduate and research graduate education is associated with new company startups. So Canada is working to bridge the gap in PhD production, but it's been slower coming at that, partly because the provinces fund headcount at the undergraduate level. The other is that we don't have a skills gap in Canada, we have a location gap. So if you look at the trades, for example, Alberta's been a huge magnet for attracting people from across the country with particular trade-related skills. So a province like Ontario has lost population to other parts of the country. If you could rebalance the country, it's not a matter of the degrees or preparation not being there, it's just where do people want to go and look in a competitive environment, in a highly mobile environment, they're going to go where they have a good living and a good quality of life. So,
I would say here in the Bay Area, indeed, there is a lot of pressure to, especially from Silicon Valley corporations, to increase the number of science and engineering graduates. In some ways, we would like to be able to do that if there's no cost to the rest of the university. But for one of the Silicon Valley leaders, I did the arithmetic, so which is interesting, because their instinct was, well, you can educate 20% more engineers, your tuition is $12,000, right? So, that's $500,000 basically, right? Or thereabouts annually. In fact, the actual number is 800 million. And say, how could that possibly be? That's a completely crazy number. And it's that large because if we were going to increase the number of engineering graduates by 20%, then in order to maintain the quality of the faculty, we have to increase the size of the faculty by 20%. That's 40 new faculty members. That means we have to build 2 new research buildings. We have to provide $1 to $2 million startup packages for each professor. And when you add it all up, you end up at $800 million. That's the real cost. It is the real cost. So I said to this person in Silicon Valley, well, if you make a donation of $800 million, I can probably convince the faculty that we will expand our engineering, we'll increase our undergraduate body by 80 students.
And they can join your board.
Right.
We have time for one or two more questions. Oh, right.
That's a great.
Chancellor Birgeneau, your suggestion seems to be a very modest restatement of Bartlett and Steele's What Wrong with America, and I'm wondering if you had read the book and what you think about their new book.
No, I have not read it. But people discover things independently of each other. That's why Nobel Prizes get shared.
All right, we have a question.
Yeah. I just wanted to pick up on both of you referred to tuition. Canada is gaining a reputation of having very good quality research universities at a much more affordable tuition level than U.S. universities. And I noticed that people are very interested in sending their children up to Canada. I just wondered, is that differential accurate, and what does it mean for the long-term prospects of access to education? I'm thinking more of a differential approach now between looking at Canada vis-a-vis the U.S. Thanks.
Well, it's interesting, and this may be a point of tension between Bob and I. We share values in common enormously. I've always said that we are not seeking American tuition fees in the Canadian context, but we want to be able to afford the enterprise. I find that a fascinating example that you've just given in engineering. Different disciplines cost different amounts. Research linked to education costs more. And then if you want to bring in international experience, applied experience, the optimal technology assists to classroom or campus-based learning, which I think is very important. This all costs. And I think, and this has been, every year the rankings come out, they each do something slightly different, but they are important in terms of the way our two countries are viewed internationally. And the US has actually dominated the rankings, the top 50, the top 100, and that's a fragile state currently. Canada has only 3 universities that are always in the top of the rankings, no matter where, now a tenth of the population. So you can't squeeze indefinitely, and I would say that all who benefit from those who have an educated citizenry and a really powerful professional and knowledge contribution entity need to contribute to the cost. And so we need to go up in Quebec from where we are. I think the average of Canada actually works pretty well, building in inflation and then customizing that around the particular mission and mandate of the institution. So I think the compact is not a bad idea if it goes beyond words and is substantive.
So it's manifestly it's gross versus net, so which are two very different numbers. So in the UC system, if your family income is under $80,000, the tuition is exactly zero. So it's zero. And if you're at Berkeley, if your income is between 80 and 150, then it's scaled down. So it goes from zero up to about $12,000. And so then the question is, if your family income is more than $150,000, is it unreasonable for your parents to have to pay $12,000 a year, which is about 1/3 of the cost of the total cost of education? That to me seems to be quite reasonable. One of the people on that list, Tom Siebel, who's on our Lincoln Project Advisory Committee, he has one kid at Princeton and one kid at Berkeley, and he says he's convinced they're getting exactly equivalent quality education, and he pays more than $40,000 to Princeton tuition, and he pays $12,000 to Berkeley. He thinks it's crazy.
Mm-hmm. So we have Quebec families.
He said, I don't understand why
you're
not asking me for $40,000 tuition. Well, then we get into because that's a decimal point. That's anyway for his life situation. But deciding what represents
Berkeley's even anomalous within the American
but what
context,
represents an appropriate tuition for for families that can afford it. That's a difficult question, and I think there's not a simple answer to it. But my view, quite strongly, as you can tell already, is if you have tuitions, if Tom Siebel's paying $2,000, that's wrong, right? I think it's just wrong. I mean, I think people from affluent backgrounds should make a larger contribution to the cost of education.
Chancellor, this is Brad Barber. I'm intrigued by your proposal to tax offshore income.
I don't want to tax it. I want them to donate it.
Okay, put it.
No, it's very different.
Right.
It shouldn't be a tax. As soon as you say tax, right, then there is one party that will vote absolutely no. The one thing we've learned, this is a serious comment on this, and if you actually looked at the party affiliations of the people on our committee, they turn out to be mostly Republicans, partly by accident, but not completely. We're not going to make progress if we don't get bipartisan support.
So the question is, the existence of this huge pool of offshore money is a result of tax policy that may not last forever. It may change. Your proposal was to use it to allow annual support. Would you also support it to allow contributions to endowment that might make a solution to the problem more permanent?
That's even better. Yeah. Sure. I love that. Right. So
that's a project I'd like to work on.
Right, but I mean, it's a serious issue for the country, not just my sort of idea of the 1%, but that there's well over $1 trillion, which we need in the American economy, right? Which is sitting there offshore. It's completely wrong. I mean, and when we're still in a period where we're financially challenged.
And that's just corporations.
Yeah. That's just corporate. You're right. So just my realization when you do the arithmetic that for California 1% solves it, right? We had a tax amnesty in the 80s, I guess, right, for offshore money. I mean, so this is not an amnesty for 100%, only for 1%, right? So,
I did want to though question the issue, and again, the public policy culture and practice of Canada and the U.S. have differed in a number of respects, but is it something we have to assume that we will never recover a priority to education? Certainly in Canada, healthcare spending has dramatically displaced. I mean, if you say, where did that wonderful 1960s value of, in the province of Ontario in the 1960s, 60% of provincial spending was on education. And you can imagine that is not the case today. Is there a moment when we say, really looking at both economic prosperity and the health and well-being of the people in our place, that we have to rejig the priorities? And it's not going to be healthcare here, but there's spending going on. There's a lot of money being spent.
I'm very pessimistic about that happening, partly because of polling, which shows dramatically in California that the public have changed their mind, and dramatically in that 30 years ago, when you polled people, they saw public higher education as a public good. Now 2/3 of Californians see it as primarily a private good. And so as long as the voters think that public higher education is actually primarily a private good, then it's very unlikely that this trend is going to reverse itself.
And that's different in Canada.
Yeah.
That's interesting.
Yeah.
Education has a very high priority in Poland.
No, education has a high priority. So when you poll it and you say to people, is education a high priority? 80% say yes, it's high priority. Then you say,
how much will you spend on it?
No, if you say, but is it a public or private good? 2/3 of Californians say it's a private good.
Yeah.
What do they mean private good?
They mean the individual profits, that the primary role it plays is the profit of the individual, not society as a whole.
Yeah. when a paradox.
It's a shocking result.
It is.
But it helps you understand a lot. As soon as you hear that fact, you can understand a lot of things that have happened.
One of the things,
That's a whole.
yeah.
I think I understand that too, but that's another discussion.
One of the things that Bob taught me when we worked together, having just come from MIT, is that the research-intensive universities we think of as private in the U.S. are not all that private either.
Correct. Right. Yeah.
Which is, I think the fact that they're viewed to be private influences that public perception.
Yeah, right.
But in fact, it isn't true. From a tax basis, from a research basis, on and on.
So if you look at the federal government's contribution to Stanford through having the $800 million be tax deductible, right? Just do the arithmetic. That's a $300 million a year contribution to the operating budget of Stanford from the federal government through tax policy.
Plus Pell Grants.
Yeah, not counting Pell Grants, just a straight, the federal tax deduction for the philanthropy given to Stanford exceeds the state funding of Berkeley.
This is going to be really the last question.
That's Henry Brady left, but that was his observation, a really perceptive one. Yeah.
So Kim Voss, sociology. So my question actually follows nicely on that. One clear difference between Canada and the U.S. is the large number of private universities that there are in the U.S. So the whole higher education field is different. So I just wondered if you could talk a little bit about what difference that makes. I think you've just touched on it. But overall, it makes what people think about higher education different, and the sort of competition that the public universities face also different.
Over to you on that, Bob.
I mean, having been president in both countries, it is fundamentally different. And that, by the way, Claude, maybe we should introduce Claude Steele, our new provost, who's graciously moved from across the bay to lead us. I should be careful about making sarcastic, any comments about Stanford, but right. But in fact, it is a primary difference because we have a set of wonderful private universities that provide a level of competition that's just doesn't exist in Canada. Personally, I think Canada would be better off if they had elite private universities. And so I view having great private universities which are complementary to the public universities is a good thing, not a bad thing.
Allows you to test yourself out against.
Yeah. All right. Well, I'd like to
thank Irene, could I just, before we finish, just thank you so much for doing this. To say I'm proud of you and Nelson and Brendan is putting it mildly, but, and Bob, to thank you for the idea. It's just fantastic to be able to get together. California and Canada have a really strong partnership in just about every domain of civil society, and to have McGill alums here at Berkeley is a source of great pride. To be here at this program today has been just wonderful, so thank you for that.
Well, and actually I think our biography shows sort of the international movement of people, what you were talking about. So Nelson coming from Europe, Brennan going from the United States up to Canada, I going through a circuitous path down to the United States, so it really speaks to the topic. Thank you both of our speakers who have taken time out of extremely busy schedules to share their experiences.